Cool. Awesome. So glad to have you here,
It's
Susan.
good to be here. Thanks.
So, um, so I like to like just kind of do a little icebreaker, ask some big questions, and then ask kind of origin story and go through your journey a little bit. So I just noticed that you were in Italy. What was that all about?
So it was a great three-part trip. So the first part is I was speaking at a conference, Accelerate 2050. It was about half impact investors, mostly from Europe, and half entrepreneurs who have climate solutions, mostly from Europe, a few from the States like me. Um, then I had 4 days where I rented a car and drove to Sicily, and stayed on a
Nice,
regenerative farm in the middle of Sicily, just me. And it
nice.
was so fun. I got to meet the owner, fifth generation, but the Masseria had been abandoned in the 80s. And he was a finance guy. And then got in his head that he wanted to restore the family farm. And so he started building, and now it's super regenerative and organic, but it's also a leading hotel of the world, a small hotel of the world. And so, sort of the best of both worlds, and it was stunning. And then the fam came in on Monday, and we did a week of family vacation in Sicily, which was great too.
Wow, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, as you probably know, like Elena's Italian, and we spend a lot of time there.
Oh, do you? I don't think
Yeah,
I knew
I
Elena
don't
was
know.
Italian,
I've
actually.
probably been there. I don't know.
In
15
Sicily
times?
or
No,
broadly?
no, all over. We actually tend to spend, so Florence is my favorite city. So I've been there the most. But this last time we were actually spent time all over, but mostly in Amalfi, which we had not been to. We actually went to the Amalfi when we first met 22 years ago, and we had not been back.
That's where
And
Peter and I started our honeymoon in the Amalfi
yeah,
Coast.
yeah, yeah.
And
So
so my surprise highlight was this little town on the coast of Calabria in the most southern part, right before you get on the ferry to go to Sicily, called Tropea. And we stayed in this monastery that had been renovated, or I stayed in a monastery that had been renovated, but it overlooked a farm and then the ocean. And so it was, the farm went right up to the ocean, and then the town was a hilltop town sort of across this gully that was one of those old walled cities inside, and it wasn't overrun with tourists. It was incredible. It's still touristy, but not nearly the sort of chaos that is Taormina these days. And
yeah,
so
yeah, yeah,
it
yeah.
was really, really fun. And there was this very cool restaurant in the monastery where they don't waste a thing. So all the carrot tops get turned into food and stuff like that, and they everything's local. And they set me up the next day with a dairy um, that I got to go see, that not only is got amazing cheese that they had served at the dinner and things like that, but they take all the cow manure and turn it into energy, and they power not just the dairy but 6,000 of the neighbor homes, all off of all using biogas essentially from this. It was sort of circularity at its finest, renewable at its finest. I can't tell you the smell was the best, but
That's awesome.
it was
That's
pretty
awesome.
cool to see.
Well, I always feel like my blood pressure goes down like massively when I'm in Italy, so I'm
Southern
ready to go
Europe in
back.
general, Spain,
Yeah,
Italy,
yeah,
Portugal.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. All right, so I actually like I think it's kind of interesting to ask people like who kind of further along in their careers, especially for students who are starting out. What if you just had to try and capsulize like what are you proudest of in your career? What would you say?
I think in general, just this ability to go between what I'm going to call corporate worlds, very big companies like the New York Times or like all of WeSpire's customers, and to be able to navigate well in the corporate world and also to be able to invent things from scratch. And I think that might be a little bit of my superpower, is just the ability to do both and to context switch really well and kind of put myself as an entrepreneur and as a founder into our customers' shoes and what it's like to be a big company and try to get things done. And while I have come to realize the thing I love the most to do is to start and build things from scratch and solve big problems from scratch, I still really believe in the power of the market and large companies to transform the world better than many other organizations. And so being able to work with them well is something I'm really proud of.
So these are so that we have 14 students. They're 19, 20, they're freshmen, sophomores, soccer, basketball, and rowers. So if you were to tell them like one thing you did absolutely wrong that they should avoid, what would that be?
Oh gosh, I got
You
a
can only
list of
pick
like
you can only pick one. Yeah,
100,000.
you
I
can only
only get
pick
to pick
one. Yeah.
one, Tom.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. So I think it would honestly be the thing that I look back at and just wish I had done differently, hindsight being 2020, is really appreciate when you've reached a point in a business where there's no unicorn outcome, there's no multi-billion dollar outcome, and you just have to run it a different way. And just to have been smarter about that and not keep swinging for the fences and just realize there is a different path. Um, and the best way to get on that path is in the most practical, and I think this is true in your personal life, not just your professional life as an entrepreneur, is just make sure you're making more than you spent, you know? And I think we just got to a point where had I taken that approach at WeSpire of always making more than we'd spend, we might not have had to make some of the decisions that I regret. But that was at the core of those decisions needing to be made was the fact we were spending more than we were making. And I think, but I look at it in personal life and I look at my friends who find themselves with what I'm just going to call the golden handcuffs, where they hate their job, but they've got a lifestyle that they've built up where they kind of have to stay because they can't afford to leave, because they just raise their fixed costs to a level that they've got to continue to do whatever that job is that is lucrative but not rewarding. And so I don't think it's just a business thing. I think it's a life thing as well. And I just got very lucky that, I'm more of the idea person and think you're going to be able to do that. And I married an accountant and he's very practical. And I think in our home life, we've been a little more disciplined. So as Tom knows, because he spent a few months, years as our part-time fractional CFO, I need good CFOs to ensure I'm making good decisions on that front because I'm always dreaming.
Yeah, I think we had that conversation once.
Hmm.
I mean, but it seems like that's always the tension, right? The tension is between the dream and the reality, and like you got to
The
walk that
dream and the
line. Yeah.
right, the dream and the reality, and I think there's a mythology in startups that I actually get angry with now that I've been through it a few times. And that is that, if it's not a billion-dollar unicorn business, somehow it's not worthwhile, and that the venture path is the only path or the private equity path is the only path and things like that. And the reality is there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of really good businesses out there. And I've certainly gotten a front row seat of seeing much more of this by being part of YPO with this Young Presidents Organization, where it's just a lot of what people might call lifestyle businesses. And they in the venture world, they call them lifestyle businesses in a derogatory way, as it's like it's not good. Well, it's not good for a venture investor, but it doesn't mean it's not a good business. It doesn't mean it's not a good life. And I think what can happen a lot is an entrepreneur is you start something thinking it's going to be big, and then for whatever reason it's not. And that I think your alignment with the people around you, whether that's your investors or your board or your employees, when you hit that stage becomes the most critical because as you've witnessed and I've witnessed, it's when you get out of alignment in terms of expectations and those things that bad decisions happen.
Yeah, as usual, like in our conversations, like I could talk the whole time about this, but like just one more point, which is like for me, like that's really the transition. I ran a venture capital firm,
Yeah.
and so like at a certain point, like every idea has to be huge for it to work. That's the game,
Yeah.
right? It's like, well, let's invest in, $15 billion ideas and hope that one of them pans out.
Mhm.
Like that's it. And like actually, as a venture capitalist, I found that very, very frustrating. And so honestly, like moving over to search funds and kind of small private equity is exactly those are all the YPO guys, right? They're all
Yeah.
buying like little like boring 2 to 5 million.
HVAC.
Yeah, right, right. And like those, you can make a ton of money investing in
Mhm.
those kinds of business. And in fact, for me, anyways, it's a lot more enjoyable because they're kind of unbreakable. And
Yeah.
so you can take a young person that's super smart and you can coach them up to be a CEO over 4 or 5 years because they can't break it. And then once they learn how to grow it, then you can make a bunch of money together.
Well, and I
Anyhow,
think the other part of it that sort of feeds into it is there's no media around that's sort of popularized and around what I'm just going to call old-fashioned modest growth but profitable businesses. So much of what happens around entrepreneurship is TechCrunch and all of the sort of go big or go home kind of things. And so I think young people coming out of school don't even realize, and maybe even out of MBA programs, don't even realize there's kind of this other path that a lot of people could follow and have an opportunity to build incredible businesses. And you're right, they're hard to break. And what tends to break them is some big, what you and I got a front row seat on at the in the newspaper business. It's just a massive secular change that changes an entire
but
industry. As opposed to the market wasn't big enough, or the product market fit was never hit, or you couldn't scale a sales team fast enough, and so your competitor won. You've got time to work it out until you don't.
yeah, I mean, honestly, like I am gonna move on, but like the to me, it's all about like the world is dominated by the Magnificent Seven. That's it. Like, it's just like no one thinks about anything else. So,
And there's a
one thing I
lot of
wanted to
other
touch,
good businesses out there.
yeah, one thing I
Go
want to
for
touch
it.
on before we go kind of back to the beginning, origin stories. It just happened that the way this course developed, we have all male students. We're going to have a co-ed cohort next year when we do this. Um, but I just think it's important for them to hear what it's been like for you as a female entrepreneur, particularly with venture investors and all that kind of stuff. What's that
Yeah.
experience been like for you?
Yeah, it's interesting. Some of the students that I had the one-on-ones with asked me about that. And so I would say I was very fortunate in that I kind of grew up in a world where I was often the only female. So it just so happened that my neighborhood was filled with all boys, and my sister and I were the only girls. When I started playing soccer when I was 6 years old, it was all boys. And so I played on the boys team up until high school. And then when you go to business school, I went to business school when it was 75-25, and so so coming into tech as an entrepreneur, I was kind of used to being in the minority. So it didn't stick out to me, particularly my first startup. I had no idea the data wasn't great around funding, and we got funded. We got funded by Venrock, and we were two females, and my founder who I joined, has gone on to be one of the most successful venture capitalists, pre-seed and seed in the world. So I just didn't feel it. Where I started to feel it a lot more was actually after I became a parent. Funny enough,
Yeah, yeah,
I almost felt like it was almost more like mom discrimination than female discrimination. It was like, well, how could you possibly juggle kids and this? And then the other thing I just noticed is that for whatever reason, somebody else was having a bad day or something else was happening in their life who was in a position of power with me. Their fund wasn't going well, or their business wasn't going well, or something like that. Boy, did I end up a punching bag a decent amount of time for what weren't really the problems that, it was like almost I became the foil for that because I think it was easier to scream at a female than it was to scream at a male.
uh,
And stuff like that. Or maybe I'm just a personality where I just sort of grin and bear it. And I think that's what I see a lot of female entrepreneurs. I count myself very lucky. I don't have this like massively terrible Me Too moment like many female founders do. I mean, the things I have heard from other women founders are really abhorrent. And I feel lucky. But have I found myself, on the downside of some really weird comments? Absolutely. Have I had to censure a board member? Yes. And so, I think it hasn't been easy. I've often been the only, but I don't find you get very far if you live with a chip on your shoulder when you walk in the room. And
yeah.
so I think my advice for anyone who finds themselves not being in the majority. And one thing I want to mention, and this was something that when WeSpar was doing inclusion work, I really emphasized is you're depending on what culture you're in, men can be in the minority. If you're a nurse, if you're a teacher, you may often find yourself in the minority. So any person who is in, sort of out of the house, in a group of people that all seem similar, is going to find themselves sometimes not feeling comfortable, and you just have to learn to, put your best foot forward, um, and show up every day. Don't assume malintent until it actually happens. And again, roll with the punches. You got to learn to have thick skin. And should it change? Yes. Will it change? Slowly. But it hasn't, it hasn't necessarily been dramatically better. It just hasn't been dramatically worse.
Yeah. All right, so let's go back to the beginning and kind of move through your journey a little bit. What did you get the most? What did you value the most out of your Wesleyan experience? Realizing that these guys are all freshmen and sophomores.
Yeah, absolutely. So, kind of two things. First was I had a professor I was a government major, econ minor, and I had a professor who had been the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under Lyndon Johnson. He'd been superintendent of the Boston School District. He was just amazing, and for whatever reason, decided to take me under his wing. And I don't think that would have happened in a larger school, and I don't think I would have had that type of relationship. As an alumni, I went over to he and his wife's apartment when we first moved to Boston, and they held something for us. He would bring students to their summer home in Little Compton with a bunch of people, and it was just special. And I just don't think you'd have a relationship. So my advice to students is find mentors, find professors who care. They are there. That is the benefit of going to a small school. And for me, that ended up leading to an internship with the General Accountability Office, which, if nothing else, told me I did not want to go into government service, which is something a lot of government majors do. It sort of put me on the path to go into corporate recruiting. But I was grateful for that experience. And I would say the other thing that was very powerful were just the different jobs I held. And so I worked for the Office of Public Information, which is sort of like the internal communications department of Wesleyan as my work study. I did a job in database stuff at night. I called for the Wesleyan Annual Fund, which is how I learned to do sales. Like that was my first sales training, was an on-campus job. I was an RA. And then my summer opportunities, which all came through Wesleyan alumni. I worked for WBUR up here because the guy who was up here ran Car Talk, that show, and he was a Wesleyan alum. And I mentioned what Dr. Wood did. And then, so those were great experiences. But so it's the network, it's the people, it's the fact you can build those personal relationships, and it's the jobs you get because of them. But try to have as many as you can, because a lot of what I found is I got to figure out what I didn't want to do by trying things as much as I found what I wanted to do by trying things.
Yeah, those are all themes we've hit on pretty hard here. Yeah, and Wood was also the president of UMass at one point, I think, right?
He was.
Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah,
anyway,
he was amazing.
yeah, so we had a nice little email or text chain going. So after Wesleyan, you worked at APM, which is a healthcare. Just so the students know, it's a healthcare consulting company. And I also worked at APM. You worked there longer than I did. I lasted for like less than 6 months and like walked out because like I couldn't stand it. But what was your experience at APM?
So I lasted about, I guess that makes it almost three times as long as you,
Yeah.
but but still not a ridiculously long career. So it's interesting. I have often said to undergrads who are even remotely interested in business that I thank my 4 years of management consulting for being like a boot camp for business. And I had been deciding whether to go to Goldman Sachs or APM out of undergrad, and counterintuitively chose APM because I wanted to fix healthcare, not municipal bonds. And the I'm really glad I did. And my reason was that I shadowed two students, and all the Goldman Sachs person did is look at spreadsheets all day and sleep under the desk. And I will say, as much as I hated what I ended up doing, mostly because it was going into hospitals and figuring out what they were spending money on and where they were spending too much. And then it inevitably, at the end of it, led to layoffs. We had death threats on a couple clients in Canada. I mean, it was bad. But I learned a ton about business, and I learned how businesses run and how they operated and how to look at the numbers and how to benchmark and how to do good presentations and storyboard. So that was an amazing experience. But most importantly, I just met this incredible group of people for all of the challenges. I look at the partners I worked for, Saad Alawi and Paul Lavin at APM, who I ended up following to Mercer, now Oliver Wyman. Neil Shaw, one of my coworkers, Mark Galletti, one of my coworkers I was on a couple projects with, and they're just friends to this day. And I think that's one of the really unusual things about your first job out of college is, everyone's young and in, a job. And in this case, it was a very intense job. So you spent a lot of time together. And so we just made great friends. And then as I shared with Tom, probably the best thing that came out of my 4 years of management consulting is I did meet my now husband, Peter, in the very last year when I was at Mercer, and he did his summer internship between his first and second year of business school. And so we met then. One of my colleagues basically did his cell interview before he joined and said, I just met the man you're going to marry. Walked out
Oh,
and literally
nice.
said that. Isn't that funny? Yeah. So that was the best
Yeah, I
part of
was.
management consulting.
Yeah, I was. We were comparing notes, and I was remembering that I was sitting in some conference room in the middle of the night, like doing like basically a kindergarten project because there was no PowerPoint, and so like literally, like we were like cutting and pasting.
Cut and
Like
glue.
I was like, it's like, oh my God, why am I doing this? And like that was it. I was out. But
Yeah.
anyway, so you eventually made your way to Tuck. So what did you get out of the Tuck experience?
Well, so there was actually a really important year before I went to Tuck. I quit my job. I backpacked around the world for 9 months, six of them solo, three with Peter. Um, and I was supposed to start Tuck when I came home, and I had spent all the money I had for business school, and didn't know why I was going to business school because on this trip I was trying to research a startup idea that I'd had for volunteer vacations, and the demand from the young people side was very high. The desire of NGOs to offer week-long volunteering vacations to a bunch of young adults was zero. So it was a problem with supply. So I didn't know what I was going to do when I went to business school. So Paul, one of the partners from Mercer, called me and said, what can I do to convince you not to go to business school? And I sort of jokingly was like, help me pay for it. And he's like, okay, you give me 1 year, I'll help. And so I actually went and worked for Alexander and Alexander, and this gentleman named Frank Sarb had come over and was running it. He went on to run NASDAQ and a bunch of other things. Really interesting guy. And that was my first introduction to tech. My job was to do a technology transformation project to get this old line insurance brokerage firm onto this thing called the internet. What it did is it meant that when I went to Tuck, I spent 2 years focused completely on how do you do the business of the internet? And that was 96, which was really early. We actually helped three of my friends, we ganged up together and went to this professor and said, we need to create an internet marketing class. And so we created an internet marketing class. I ended up in an internship up here in Boston, helping launch broadband cable modems. So I sat in a house in Boston when one of the first broadband modems was ever implemented. And I've been in technology since. And so what I got out of Tuck was an opportunity to spend 2 years really immersed in the internet just at the dawn of it. I sort of feel like it's a little bit like my last 2 years with AI, where I sold WeSpire and wasn't needing to spend as much time, and so I all of a sudden got to spend a ton of time with AI, and it's equally, if not more, transformative than the internet. And I feel like that was that almost a luxury to spend that much time back then doing it and focusing on it, et cetera. The other thing is I met my best female friends to this day at Tuck. It's just there's something about Dartmouth. Your blood bleeds green after you go there. Maybe it's because they make you play ice hockey. I don't know. I did start, Tom, you'll appreciate it. I did start a crew team, and the women's crew team for the women, they had a men's, they didn't have a women's. We ended up winning the NBA World Championship.
There you go.
Super
There you go.
fun.
There you go.
Yeah. But that's
So
probably
I,
the most I got out of it. Internet time and great female friends and an NBA World Rowing Championship.
there you go. So, so you went to the New York Times after that?
I did. So I decided that I had been the editor of my high school paper. I wanted to be a journalist. I didn't turn for BUR. I just couldn't really afford to do it after school. And I found myself in a position, thanks in part to Paul and some other things, that I didn't have a lot of school loans coming out. So I was kind of like, all right, I can really maybe do this journalism thing and give it a shot. And Janet Robinson, who'd been the CEO of the New York Times, actually came to talk. And at the time, we got points that you could bid to have dinner or office hours with a visiting executive. And I put all my points on Janet. And we ended up having office hours, and she invited me to come down to New York, and she had me meet the head of strategy for the New York Times, and then she had me meet Martin Niesenholtz, who was the head of digital. And Martin said to me, he's like, "I'm no Bill Gates. I can't hire an MBA. What can you actually do?" And I was like, and this is where working at the Wesleyan Annual Fund came in and helped. I'm like, "I'll sell ads on commission." And he
Yeah.
was like, "Sold, I think." Well, as it turned out, a few weeks later, I got an offer to be their first director of marketing for New York Times Digital. And so I went in. I didn't have to sell ads on commission. Peter was very relieved by that. But and I was in the first probably 20 employees, amazing group of people, and absolutely loved it. It's where I ended up meeting the woman I had joined to do my first startup. She was the girlfriend of our head of product. And I also just got to watch what it was like to see a very, very traditional organization, go through the throes of a highly, highly disruptive technology change. And, we were at the time, the small group of people, they wouldn't even really let us in the main building. We were sort of over there. And maybe that was for our own protection, or maybe it was because they just weren't ready to embrace it yet. But it felt like this different thing. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh, this is a really big thing. One of my favorite stories is at one point they were going to do a tracking stock. And so I actually still have the documentation for a tracking stock for the New York Times, which, as we now know in history, they never actually did. But that was one thing that was happening in the
Is this
that.
tracking stuff for the digital assets?
Hmm.
Oh, that's crazy. Oh, that's crazy.
Uh-huh.
Well,
Remember back then, that was the
that
thing you did.
that would be everything now. But
Uh-huh.
so I'm actually fascinated from from a newspaper background. So what was the thinking at that point in time? What the business model was going to be?
Well, so there was actually you know, a debate for obvious reasons. Internally, because the Wall Street Journal was charging, and the New York Times had been requiring registration, but not charging except internationally. And as I got there, they had just pulled down the charging for the international. And then the other part that people don't really remember is that another big part of the digital asset revenue back then was that AOL, remember them? They used to pay big amounts of money for media companies to offer their properties through the AOL platform, but the AOL platform was kind of, as a closed environment, was tumbling, and it was going more to an open environment. And so um, the New York Times was very smart, in particular related to advertising. And I think that's because Martin came out of advertising. And so we had actually built this behavior-based digital targeting business. So we were one of the very first media companies to have behavior-based digital ad targeting. And so for us at that time, volume and the ability to target by having data about your gender, your age, your geography, things like that was paramount. And so that's how we were making all of our money. It was only really in the mid 2000s when I left, did a startup, came back to the Times, but up here in Boston. And that's when the writing started to be on the wall about what I would call the secular decline in digital advertising, and the CPM started
Right, right,
plunging.
right.
And it was only when that rodeo started itself that everybody was like, we got to start making money from the consumer and we got to start doing digital subscriptions. And the New York Times killed it. Yasmin Namini, who had been my manager here at the Globe, I'd known her from the Times, went back. And, the juggernaut that is the Times on the digital subscription is because what they did, which was really smart, is they took all the people from circulation who actually were digital subscription marketers because it was a digital subscription business on the print side, and put them in charge and then brought other folks in, who really knew how to do the piece and grew that team. And thank goodness they did, because the advertising revenue is still a part of the revenue stream, but it isn't nearly what it used to be, as anybody knows who looks at the P&L.
Yeah, I want to get to WeSpire, so I'm going to fast forward a little bit, but I can't help but ask, like, so what do you and so you went on to run Boston.com.
Mhm.
So how do you what's your take on where we are now? So and that ultimately Boston Globe ultimately got spun out and sold, and it's now owned by John Henry and run by Linda Henry, and et cetera, et cetera. What's your take on like what the world is like now compared to what the world was like when you were running it?
So there were huge structural cost issues in every news organization, and the Globe was no exception. Tied primarily to labor contracts and labor contracts that have been negotiated before the even thought of a digital business, had sort of really hit the mainstream, and things like that. And so, there were some epic, and these are public, I'm not saying anything that's not public, epic labor battles around cost because the Boston Globe, for example, had a ton of lifetime job guarantees, and the fine print made it so that even if they had tried to go all digital, those lifetime job guarantees would have accrued to digital. And so it would have sunk the digital operation. I was sitting in the leadership team of these businesses as we were modeling what digital only looked like, and we couldn't make it, just because of the way the contracts were. And so a lot of what the late 2000s, early 2010s were about really sorting out labor contracts. And if you're a labor lawyer, that's fascinating and interesting fun. If you're not, it's sort of like sit around and wait till they do it, and hope for the best on both fronts. I think from everything I've heard and seen as a subscriber, John and Linda have done an incredible job stewarding a community asset and doing the best they can in what is still an incredibly challenging environment. And yet I do fundamentally believe that local news and local media, and the New York Times is a different story because it's national and global, and you really have to look at it differently. But is what holds truth to power. It is what gives people who don't have a voice a voice. And when you lose local media, you lose safety, you lose security, you lose, things get corrupt, and the data right now around news deserts in America, there was something this weekend that came out, is just really, really tragic. Now, there's also some really interesting innovation going on. And so whether, it's what Charlie Sennett and the team on Martha's Vineyard are trying to do, or, the local news that Ellen Clegg, for example, another Globee, is doing here in Brookline and things like that, of trying to do these digital first local news orgs. But the aggregators eat the internet, and so unless you can figure out how to get, and the aggregators used to be, the search engines, and now AI is going to make this really interesting. How do you get news into people's hands? If the aggregators are hard to crack, and I think that's something that the industry is going to have to wrestle with. But ultimately, one of the reasons I was passionate about sustainability, I'd actually pitched doing V1 of WeSpire as part of the New York Times and the innovation. And because of the '08 crash, it really didn't work out. But one of my reasons, for wanting to go into a pure play digital business is I just knew this was going to be a really, really hard fight, and that, whoever was leading this was going to need to have deep pockets.
Yeah, so just a little history. At the Providence Journal, when I became CFO, it had been a monopoly asset with huge margins, cash flow for 175 years, had never laid off a reporter ever.
Hmm.
And we had the good fortune of having a massively overfunded pension plan.
Hmm.
So we could buy out a large number of reporters that we needed to from a cost perspective, which of course made me enemy number one before I even sold the business to a bunch of Texans. But
Well,
just
my,
but it was the
you
same. It
know,
was the same issue. It was the same issue, which
same
is like
issue. The
it was
next
like
job up for me was publisher, and I was like,
yeah,
this,
yeah, yeah,
that and the New York Times was selling the Globe. And so,
yeah, yeah,
I loved being part of the New York Times. And I still consider myself a New York Times person. I'm really proud of my time at the Globe, but when it became clear that the New York Times wasn't going to own it anymore, and for a while it was not clear that it was going to be a good steward like the Henrys buying it,
yeah, yeah.
I decided startup land seemed interesting. And it was I think I have this ability to see the world sometimes 12 to 18 months in advance. It was just as sustainability was starting to become this thing. And I happened a thing I happened to be passionate about. I'd come back to grad school at night in sustainable design with a 2 year old, you know,
Right,
uh,
right.
to study, sustainable living because it was sustainable design was the closest thing I could find to it. I was blogging about it on my, whatever spare time I had. And so it just ended up being a passion project first and foremost, and then it became a business.
Yeah, so maybe it's hard to kind of summarize 14 years, but at Wheatspire, kind of what were you trying to accomplish, and what do you think you did end up accomplishing?
Yeah, I would put WeSpire in three different phases. So the very first 18 months, the sort of scrappy first round of capital, all of that was a consumer app to help people be more sustainable. Think Strava for sustainability or Runkeeper for sustainability. And the because I'd come out of a consumer background, I knew the metrics you needed to hit for it to have viral growth, and we just weren't hitting it at the 18-month mark. And I came really close to shutting it down. But we got on the Today Show, and you don't shut down before you try on the Today Show. So we went, and we did not get nearly the traffic or any of the metrics that you would need to stay in business as a consumer app. But this weird thing happened. And it's lesson number one in entrepreneurship, which is sometimes listen to the calls you're getting, not the ones you're making. And it was heads of sustainability calling and asking if we had an enterprise version of our app. And we were, why, And it turned out they'd set these goals, they'd done all the sort of central command and control, and now the big opportunities left required employee behavior change around sustainability, and they didn't have a tool. So that became really what We Spire version 2 was pretty exclusively until about 2015, 2016. The problem was it just didn't end up being, we thought it was going to be this big market that all of a sudden every company was going to need this, and it just wasn't. And so,
Yeah,
um, and a little bit like the world we're living in right now, sustainability got political. And so when the, forces in power changed, the pressure on companies to evolve got less. And so we were finding ourselves just in not a great spot. Our partner, who had been a large energy management company, was supposed to be reselling us. They, ended up having to sell and got bought by an Italian utility and sort of shut down the team we were doing, lost our revenue guarantee. It was not a fun, well, you remember those days. That was not a fun period of time. And the fact we made it through that might be one of the things on my top five pride lists is that we got through that period. But the way we got through was by really understanding that companies, while they may not be continuing to lean into sustainability as strongly, they were in fact leaning into employee engagement around impact more broadly. And they were leaning in. And we got our first sense of that when somebody tried to buy us who was in the volunteering and giving space. And so we decided to expand into doing all the impact related programs. We took what we built for sustainability and did CSR, did D&I, did well-being, and that's had two real big benefits. The first was that our sustainability programs had kind of a shelf life of 2 to 3 years and were a little churny. Um, by getting the volunteering and then the giving in particular, the churn was incredible. People who had that module had like a 99% retention rate. So it solved that problem, which in SaaS is a really important problem to solve. And it meant, we became kind of this one-stop shop, which, as people were starting to really have ESG strategies, nobody wanted three ESG platforms, one for sustainability, one for volunteering, giving, one for D&I. So the fact we could do it all started to make us achieve some of the metrics you need to achieve in SaaS. It enabled us to raise our Series B, refinance some debt, sort of get past the sort of trap we'd been in of this sort of 2.5 million ARR company and begin to grow out of that, get really good metrics. And so that was kind of exciting. And then we started to get competitor interest in buying us and in acquiring us. And so, we closed our Series B, and then within 12 months, probably we're entertaining offers.
So one question I like to ask was is what day in your professional life did you have the most fun?
It was funny when I saw that question as a prep. I had the funniest flashback, and people are going to think I'm a total masochist, but so I was on vacation with my family at Disney World, and um, we were scrambling to launch for MGM. And MGM was our biggest client at the time. And it was a mobile app, and it was the platform, and we were running behind. And so I found myself pulling an all-nighter with the team, from like the garage of the rental house in Florida. And then like while standing in line, waiting for Tinkerbell, on the phone, talking and things like that. But we hit the deadline. The product was great. But the thing I just remember was at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning, some of the funniest jokes being cracked and people just like laughing hysterically. And we were on video. And it was just, what it was is a sense of team and this sense of unity and this sense of we're in this together, and being a rower, there's this feeling you get when you're pulling really hard and it just doesn't feel hard anymore, set. And it just felt like the team had set, and Tom knows some of the players involved. This can be a rascally challenging crew of mostly guys to work with, and everybody's just working great. And literally some one-liners came out of that night that got framed, and things like that. But I look back and I'm like, we achieved the goal. MGM launched. We were working our butts off. I was, juggling work and family and Tinkerbell, and it was fun. It was really
That's
fun.
awesome. That's awesome. Um, yeah, I mean, one of the things I'm trying to emphasize is that, like, from an 18 and 19 year old perspective, like the things you think are important and the things you think are fun are not necessarily the things that actually turn out to be important or fun.
Yeah. I mean,
So
I got
it's
EY Entrepreneur of the Year. Was that cool? Sure.
right,
That's not the data that came to mind. The data that came to
right,
mind is when you're
right,
in the trenches with people who care, making
right,
something happen.
right. So I guess we have a little bit of time left now. So it seems like you've always been super interested in mentoring people. Like, what's that all about? Why is that important to you? Like, just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so there's formal and informal mentoring, and I've certainly done both. But I look back, and part of it is a pay it forward sense. There are people who formally or informally, like I was formally in a mentorship program with Arthur Sulzberger, who I am so grateful to for the time I was in at the time. He was incredible, and it was such a gift to get to know him. And then informally, I can point to, 50 people, John Landry. I mean, he's been an informal tech mentor for 20 years, and so part of it is a sense of giving back. Part of it is also a sense that, I'm not a common face that you see. It's getting better, but particularly, 10, 15 years ago, there just weren't that many women tech founders. And if I didn't say yes, then the chance of, a group of people, both men and women, seeing somebody who looked like me as a founder was just going to be lower. And I am a huge believer that it's hard to be it if you can't see it. And so that part of my job for young people was to be out there and to see it and to get to know them and to tell them this is possible. And, you know, and I'm not, I think there's also a tendency to put, people who've made it to a role of a founder or a CEO or a senior executive at the New York Times or something like that up on a pedestal, and just learning that they're human and they make mistakes and they screw up. And half of it is just learning to make more good decisions than bad decisions in the course of a career, and saying sorry when you make mistakes and learning from those mistakes. And some of it is just, dotting I's, crossing T's, and having systems and teaching people those. But
Yeah.
I think just being real, and people can't see that you're real unless they build a relationship with you.
So just building on that question. So again, these are like 19 and 20-year-olds who have an interest in business. And, we've been going through all kinds of education and informational interviews and mock interviews and so forth this summer. But like what kind of, if you were in their shoes, like in the next 12 months, what kind of tangible things would you tell them that they might want to do in order to pursue an interest in business in general? Because there's a wide variety.
Yeah, I think I might be a little bit of a contrarian as it relates to this question, in large part because I feel like we have professionalized high school and college, and that everybody's supposed to do the perfect set of things to check all the boxes. And I have two kids, one about to start college, one in college, and the pressure that they are under to follow a routine and do this. And I'm like, oh my God, college is such a gift of time and a gift of exploration that I would actually tell you to go do a bunch of things you never thought you would like take a pottery class, take a dance class, take a film class, go, figure out who the best professor is that everybody likes in science if you're not a science person, and go take that, because you might find you like science when it's a good teacher. Yes, summer internships are important, and I would put your time and energy towards finding internships, but also be willing to really experiment. Like, don't focus on the work you're going to do and the skills that you're going to get, as opposed to necessarily the brand, except for maybe your junior year. That junior year brand can be important, but like sophomore summer, work at a camp, volunteer on a political campaign, do something where you're going to get responsibility and you're going to get leadership and you're going to get somebody to hand you the keys, not just sit around and follow somebody, where you actually do work so that you can say, hey, this is what I accomplished. This is what I contributed. As I think in an interview, that's what people want to talk about. They want to talk about the stories of what you made happen, the leadership experience that you had. They're going to want, if you can make them laugh, you've got a job. And I think it's hard to make sitting in an office doing spreadsheets funny. It can happen. But
Well, I mean, it's kind of ironic. You're preaching to the choir here. Like I'm teaching this course, and at some level, I'm trying to encourage people to like think outside the box. Like, please don't become an investment banker. Um, but
or, do it once, because who knows?
right,
There is this very small group of people who loves that job. I just don't think
Joe's
it's
laughing
most.
his ass off because he's like the example number one. So go ahead,
There is a
Joe. Do
group
you
of
have
people
it?
who just love it. And there are people who do quantitative trading who love it. And there are people who
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
I have a friend who has been in management consulting for 35 years and she
yeah.
loves it. It's not me. But
To be
they couldn't go start businesses. They're like, they hear I'm doing startup number three and they're like, what are you, insane? I'm like,
right.
no, I just love it.
I mean, just to be fair, I've given both sides of the argument. I had my friend Greg
Yeah.
Kelly on here, who's the head of investment banking at Merrill Lynch and has been an investment banker for 35 years. So, like,
Yes.
I give both sides of the equation. Joe, do you want to ask a question? Because we are out of time now.
So I don't think you can change who you are. And I actually think that you often make the most mistakes when you're trying to change who you are in an environment. So I will say, for better or worse, Tom knows I am myself, you know, and I am a strong, opinionated person. And I also pride myself on trying to put myself in other people's shoes and see things from their perspective. Um, and so I think I've just decided that I don't have the time or the energy or the patience to worry about whether somebody is discriminating against me or not. I'm going to figure out what needs to be done, how I can be most helpful, what I can contribute, how I can contribute, and if and be a good team member. And I think that what people ultimately appreciate is they know I'm going to work harder than anybody else in the room, if not twice as hard. And they also appreciate that they don't have to work that hard to figure me out. I say what I think. I mean, I say it politely and nicely. I definitely learned from my grandmother, who was a little bit more of the, if you don't have anything nice to say, just close your mouth. you know but that doesn't mean I'm not critical, and that doesn't mean I don't give constructive feedback. It does mean that I just try to do it with a piece of heart and a piece of soul when I do it.
in the future.
Yeah, I mean, what AI is going to do to SaaS more broadly is a topic for a whole other hour and a whole different class. But what I can say, that I'm super, super excited about is the ability for AI to automate a bunch of really bad work that is not fun for people to do, and that is manual and horrible. And the process of waiting for that work to get done gums up the whole system. And then the ability for AI agents to talk to each other and do transactions between things. So let me paint the picture of the startup I'm working on right now, which is we're going to use AI to automate the process after a natural disaster ruins people's homes to do the damage assessments. So we automate the damage assessments using computer vision, satellites, LiDAR, radar, drones, and all of that. Sequenced work orders of what jobs need to be done. We then use AI agents to search their insurance, government, charity, and other funds to show what funds they're eligible for that damage. And then we match them to the right skills in the right time for the people who are coming to fix their homes. So we want to make disaster restoration of your home as easy as calling an Uber. And that's just mind blowing to people that this is going to be able to do. We could not do this without AI. And we've got a person right now. We're working with a group of veterans, 180,000 veterans who deploy after disasters, and they're the first users for this for socially vulnerable homeowners. And this couldn't have happened without it. But that's not just generative AI. It's really this process of, AI collecting data and then using modeling to figure out sequence, and then using agents to complete work, that kind of stuff. That's a great question. I would say um, probably the best advice I got was advice that I've ended up giving a lot, um, which is this phrase, you can have it all, just not all at once. And I think as a mom, and I think as an entrepreneur, and I think as somebody who wants to give back in the community and things like that, who wants to fit in my pants, there's just so much on your plate. And the reality is, it's really hard to be completely physically fit, raise perfect children, keep a perfect house, be a startup founder, or a senior executive or anything, and hold it all together. You just can't. And so things have to give, and you have to figure out what those things are. And sometimes what you just have to decide is that you're going to prioritize certain things and back burner other things. And so one of the most important books I read at the that one of the mentors recommended was called The One Thing, and it's the surprising theory behind extraordinary results. And it really does force you to really think about prioritizing four aspects of your life, the one thing that really matters, and to let everything else go.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for taking part of our course, and thank you for answering all those emails about the Google Forms I kept
Yeah,
sending you.
no problem. I appreciate you guys having me.
Cool. So, we're gonna keep you under the hour, I promise. I asked two dumb questions at the end because it kind of makes me laugh. I'm gonna do it again. What's your favorite film?
Oh, good fellas.
It's a good one. We've not
Yeah.
had that one yet. I
Oh,
think
really? Okay.
my son Seamus might have that. Not one, but top five.
Yeah.
We've watched a lot
I
together.
love
That's a good
that
one.
movie for some
Yeah,
reason.
yeah. And then, so the last question is when all the students watch this back, just one word you'd like to leave them with.
Courage. I
That's a
think
good
we
one.
live in a time that requires an extraordinary amount of courage. And I think, honestly, President Roth is doing an incredible job of being courageous. The students are getting a front row seat to what that means. But I actually think all of us are being asked to be courageous right now.
Awesome. Hey, this was a pleasure. Thank you so much. And
Absolutely.
I'll just see you soon.
See you soon. Take
All
care.
right.